I'm Bridget, 29. On paper, my life looked boringly responsible. Mid-level project manager at a small tech firm, 2 roommates who split groceries more or less evenly, a dwindling but respectable savings account that I nurtured like a plant that never quite died. For 18 months, I had been nursing a single obsession, a laptop that felt more like an instrument than a thing. Sleek, fast enough to handle the video editing course I kept saying I'd take, a whisper-quiet workhorse I had pictured on my lap in cafes while I finally finished the novel I told myself I would write someday. I scraped overtime, skipped vacations, and gave up impulse buys. It had a name in my head. I'd even made a tiny, ridiculous spreadsheet where each paycheck was a row, and the laptop was the last line, glowing like a goalpost. So, birthday morning. I expected brunch, maybe a cake from my neighbor's awkwardly enthusiastic baker son. I did not expect a Facebook post from someone named Cora, the friend of a friend who had somehow become everyone's favorite guest at family events. The post was tagged, "Surprise," and then a gallery of photos. Confetti, a living room with too many scented candles, Cora in a floral dress laughing like she'd never had to think about money in her life. At the center of one frame was a brown box being opened. The camera zoomed in, the sticker cut clear, the same model I'd been saving for, down to the custom keyboard cover I'd planned to buy at the last minute. The top of the laptop caught the light like an accusation. For a minute, I watched my chest do the weird thing it does when you're about to run and your legs haven't decided whether they'll cooperate. I scrolled back through the photos because the human brain is an unbelieving machine. Maybe the caption would say, "Gift from work," or "Gifted by generous partner," or "We pooled for this." But the caption said nothing but a string of exclamation marks and the word "blessed." The comments were full of heart emojis and "she deserves it" from people who used gifts for emotions and never once balanced a household budget. My phone buzzed. It was my mother, Diane, calling. I didn't answer at first because my mouth was still making the sound of a laugh that wasn't a laugh. She left a voicemail 5 seconds later, the tone of someone dropping a half-remembered grocery list. "Oh, I saw Cora's party. Isn't that nice? People give gifts, Bridget. Don't make a thing out of it." It was the casualness of the dismissal. Like I'd reported a flat tire and she'd offered me a broom. That did it. All the little sacrifices I'd turned into routine, all the nights I'd swallowed envy and written "someday" in margins, coalesced into a single tight thing in my throat. The laptop wasn't just a piece of hardware anymore. It was the visible meter of every favor, every "I'll pay you back" that pinballed around my life and never returned. Diane's voice in the background, mild and uninterested, made me feel as if my own life had been footnoted. I closed the photos, handed my coffee back to the counter without tasting it, and for the very first time in a long time, I felt like I could choose a different story. I opened my banking app like you open a door you've been avoiding, palms sweaty, voice in my head already rehearsing excuses. There it was. The search bar, the list of outgoing transfers. I typed Electra's name because that's what you do when you want facts, not feelings. 40 months. 57 transfers. Each one had a memo: rent, deposit, urgent, send back when you can, I'll get a job soon, promise. The numbers blurred at first, then stitched together into a shape I didn't want to see. Rent, utilities, last-minute bailouts when her car broke down, the emergency transfer before her trip to Florida, the half-dozen Venmo payments for groceries she swore she'd repay next week. I scrolled until my thumb cramped. The app's totals line punched me in the face. Over $34,000. That number hammered into the hollow places of my reasoning. $34,000 is an emergency fund. $34,000 is a down payment I could have started. It's 2 years of rent in a cheaper city, a semester of tuition, a small business starter kit. All the things I had whispered to myself when I skipped birthday presents and opted out of dinners so I could squirrel away one more paycheck. $34,000 was a life I had been postponing while I played redistributor of other people's mistakes. I sat on the couch and let the receipts run like a slideshow behind my eyes. The night I covered Electra's security deposit after she forgot to mention she'd been evicted, The time she needed rent the week my car battery died, and I spent the last of what I had left on a tow truck. The texts that started with, "I'll Venmo you back," and ended with radio silence. I remembered canceling a trip with my friends because I'd already forwarded what I thought was one last rent payment. I remembered telling myself for the 1,000th time that if I just helped a little more, she'd get on her feet. What kills me, I said aloud to an empty apartment, is that I bought her the safety net, and she used it like it was an unlimited subscription. There was practical stuff too. My credit card balance inching higher because I'd used it to bridge months I'd covered for Electra. The spreadsheet I kept privately that showed how my savings had drained. The nagging emails from student loan services with polite but firm subject lines. I'd been frugal on a diet of promises and guilt. I had delayed doctor's appointments. I postponed upgrading a laptop I desperately needed for work. I had spent years being the lender of last resort. Anger smoldered under all of it, but what surprised me was the exhaustion. Bone-deep, moral fatigue. It wasn't just the money. It was being the person who always said yes until yes. Became the shape of my life. I tapped the screen again, this time making a new document. I started listing dates, amounts, and memos. The words felt cleaner than my chest. Facts felt like armor. The spreadsheet filled, each line a small, dumb truth that added up to a verdict. At the bottom of the list, I typed a single line, not for Electra, not for my parents, but for myself. No more. I said it out loud so there'd be a sound attached to the decision. The syllables sounded miraculous and terrifying, like a bell cutting through fog. No more meant boundaries. No more meant reclaiming nights I'd given away and paychecks I'd sacrificed on the altar of other people's comfort. No more meant I was allowed to want things for myself without feeling ashamed. I closed the app, feeling lighter in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. The number still hung there, $34,000, but it wasn't a trap anymore. It was a ledger, and I was finally ready to balance it. I mapped it out the way an overworked engineer maps a product launch. Whiteboard, ruthless priorities, and a single deliverable, disengage. It felt oddly tactical, which helped. Anger is messy. Logistics are clean. Step 1. Inventory. I opened my spreadsheet again and started labeling columns like a forensic accountant. Date, amount, method, Venmo transfer check, memo text, and a final column I titled, Why I Believed Her. I didn't fill that last column with pity. I filled it with context. Eviction notice, car repair, promised job. Seeing every line laid out in neat rows made the pattern blunt and boring. It was not crisis, it was a habit. Habit can be broken. Step 2. The emails. I wrote them in drafts first, because the first thing you do when you're about to burn a bridge is draft a map of the fire. Email A to Electra's landlord. I looked up his name, Mr. Langley, and his property management address. The email was short and unemotional on purpose. Bureaucracy hates emotion and answers simple questions with simple procedures. Subject, change in payment source for Unit 3B. Dear Mr. Langley, this is Bridget Carlisle. For the last 40 months, I have been making rent payments on behalf of Electra James for Unit 3B. Effective immediately, I am no longer authorizing payments on her behalf. Please confirm receipt of this message and let me know whether you require any paperwork to terminate the automatic payment arrangement. Sincerely, Bridget Carlisle. I attached a PDF copy of the bank records that showed the recurring payment IDs and dates. The goal was legal clarity, not drama. Cut the tap and make sure the landlord heard the tap was being cut by the person who had been operating it. Email B. To my bank. I used the bank's secure message center and included account numbers and the exact transfer name the autopay used. No pleading, no hints of blame. I wrote, subject, cancellation of recurring external transfer. Hello, please cancel the recurring external transfer labeled Electra James Rent from my account, last 4 digits, 1247, effective immediately. I authorize you to stop any scheduled transfers and to provide written confirmation of the cancellation. Please respond with the date this will take effect. Thank you, Bridget Carlisle. Then I added a line asking about liability, in case anything had already been posted, because I wanted to know what the bank's algorithm would do when a tap was turned off. Email C, the longest, the messiest, and the one I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks, to my parents and anyone else in the family who'd ever texted, "Are you sure?" at 2 a.m. Subject: a clear picture. I started with facts, because facts are a kind of mercy. Dates, amounts, total. I attached the spreadsheet, a one-page PDF summary that led with the headline number, $34,126.92. I wrote out the timeline, not to humiliate Electra, but to demonstrate how this had become a pattern that affected my life. I included 3 small prose paragraphs, one explaining why I had done it, love, habit, guilt, one explaining why I was stopping, boundaries, sustainability, and one very firm sentence, "This is not negotiable." I printed everything, too. There's something about physical paper that makes consequences feel real. I slid the pages into a folder labeled "Family for Your Eyes" and left space for them to ask questions. I wanted their questions because I wanted to see if anyone could look at numbers and still claim ignorance. I didn't send them immediately. I read each draft out loud. I removed every adjective that might invite argument and left room only for verification. If I'd learned anything in 29 years, it was this: people argue with feelings, not facts, so hand them facts they can't argue with. Then I scheduled the emails. The bank message went first. I hit send and felt my palms go cold and then light. The landlord's email went a minute later. The family email I sent last at 9:03 p.m. because I wanted the blowback to land when I was awake and steady. After I hit send, I did something small but decisive. I closed every tab where Electra's messages might appear. I turned off push notifications for Venmo and my bank alerts. I'd get a confirmation about the canceled transfer. I didn't need to see every tiny drama in real time. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down with the folder. I felt ridiculous and elated and terrified, sometimes all in the space of a single breath. There was no cinematic explosion. There was a ping from my bank confirming the cancellation, a single-line auto-reply from the landlord's office asking for ID verification, both banal and final. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I'd taken back air that had been held hostage by someone else's life choices. Freedom, it turns out, starts in the inbox. I'd expected protest, maybe tears. Instead, I felt a strange, clean relief. The planning had been the hard part. Sending was the mechanic's final wrench. The car stalled, then turned over. I slept that night with the folder on my kitchen table because I liked knowing it existed like a physical promise. I had chosen myself, and I had the receipts. They didn't take it quietly. Within an hour of sending the family email, my phone turned into a tiny, bell-ringing courtroom. Group texts exploded. Every relative who'd ever asked, "Are you sure?" at 2 a.m. suddenly had opinions and very specific teeth. My sister, Hannah, texted, "Bridget, this is harsh. You could have talked to us first." My aunt's message was shorter and louder. "How could you?" The tenor was the same across the board. Hurt that I'd stopped, outrage at the method, and a quick, reflexive defense of Electra that smelled faintly of the same excuses I'd been making for years. Then my mother, Diane, decided she didn't want to be a text emoji. At 3:15 p.m., my manager tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Is everything okay, Bridget? Someone here says your mom is looking for you." I felt my mouth dry. Diane had never visited my office before. She liked her grand trips to be theatrical, but never this close to the fluorescent lights of my cubicle farm. She arrived like a meteor, not literally, but in the way of someone who had rehearsed indignation in a grocery store line. She wore the same beige cardigan she wore to every family dinner when she wanted to look calm but firm. She planted herself by my desk like a flag. "Bridget," she said loud enough for the whole open plan team to hear, "what you did is cruel." There were a dozen pairs of eyes and 2 versions of my face. The one I'd been cultivating for emails and the one that wanted to sprint into traffic. People glanced at each other with that curious sympathy reserved for soap opera scenes. My manager tried to shepherd Diane to a meeting room, but she waved him off. "You destroyed trust," my mother continued. "You humiliated Electra. You humiliated us. Do you know how this looks?" There was a line between anger and accusation in her voice that always had the effect of making me replay every awkward childhood moment where I'd done the wrong thing. "You should have consulted the family. We would have helped you find a better way." She used you like a hammer. I could feel heat in my ears, but I kept my tone small and steady. The way you speak in a lab when something volatile is about to happen and you don't want to spook the reagents. I told you everything, I said. I showed the transfers. I put the spreadsheet together so there were no surprises. I owe nobody an explanation for protecting my financial future. Her eyes flashed. So you just stopped? Overnight? Don't you think you should have told Electra first? She was told, I said. I emailed her landlord and the bank. I told her the payments were ending. I told you, Diane. I told the family through a message you all received. That last line seemed to bruise her. She shifted tactics, the way people do when they realize public performance doesn't land the same as private plea. She leaned in, voice quieter, conspiratorial. You know she's had a rough time, Bridget. We could have helped her find work. We tried that, I said. You all tried. She refused the last position that would have made her self-sufficient. And the help turned into rent checks. I'm done. There was a guilty silence. Diane's jaw worked like she was chewing on a thought she didn't want to swallow. The office filled with that awkward hum of coworkers pretending not to listen. Someone coughed. My production team leader, a woman who'd once taught me how to manage scope creep, gave me a look that was more puzzled than condemning. This was not the script she expected of a dependable teammate. My mother, though, was not finished. She walked closer and said, very quietly, "You're being selfish." That word landed like a stone in a pond. Selfish. The same word I'd used on myself in dark hours when I canceled plans or said no. She meant it as condemnation. I heard it as punctuation. I looked at her for a long second, at the familiar freckle near her mouth, at the small scar on her finger from a pot she'd once burned making stew, and something in me unclenched. I'm making a different choice, I said. I loved her. I covered for her. But I'm not going to let my life be a funding line for someone who won't try. If you want to help Electra, help her find a way to be independent. Don't make my bank account the default. Diane's face softened in a way I hadn't seen since I left college for my first job and she'd come to see me move in. There was worry there, and also disbelief. You can't just cut someone off, she said. People need safety nets. There's a difference between safety net and enabling. Seth, I replied. I enabled a pattern. I'd rather help someone get the ladder than keep holding the rope while they refuse to climb. She opened her mouth and closed it. Somewhere behind her, a coworker whispered, "Wow." Another colleague tried to steer her away again, offering water like a ref. I was aware of my heartbeat, the way it sounded like a metronome in a room that suddenly felt too loud. She left my workplace, but not without a final shot over her shoulder. This is going to bring the family apart, Bridget? Maybe. Maybe it already had. But I wasn't going to let guilt dissolve the boundary I'd drawn. The reality of it, the flatness of the bank confirmations, the weight of the folder on my kitchen table, made that line feel less like a cliff and more like the edge of a room I was finally allowed to close the door on. In the evening, my phone exploded with more texts and phone calls. Electra called twice. Both times I let it go to voicemail so there would be a record she'd attempted contact. My father, Daniel, left a terse message that was part anger, part bewilderment. We need to talk. Come home tonight. That was new. My parents didn't usually say we. It sounded like a summons. Diane texted too, shorter now. Can we come by your apartment? We need to discuss. I considered refusing. For a second, I imagined barricading myself with the folder and the projector I hadn't bought and never planned to use. Instead, I opened my calendar and set a time that night. If they wanted confrontation, they could have it in a place I controlled. If they wanted questions, they'd get facts. I closed my laptop, picked up the folder, and put it in a bag. The papers felt heavier now under the fluorescent office lights, but not in a bad way. I drove home thinking about how boundaries look small and mean on the surface, but inside they're the only thing keeping the rest of your life from spilling out. I didn't know whether my family would understand. I only knew I'd prepared the documentation and chosen a place, my apartment, where the truth would be visible and undeniable. Dinner that night was my hands shaking as I reheated something frozen and practical. I checked the email confirmations again. The bank had sent a line confirming the stop. The landlord's office had requested a scanned ID for their records. Those procedural replies had the beauty of inevitability. The finality was a quiet, concrete thing. When the doorbell rang at 7 p.m., I was standing at the threshold with the folder in one hand and my voice ready. The real confrontation was about to begin. I cleared the small dining table and set the projector down like a prop in a trial. Handheld, cheap, but precise. I'd practiced the sequence twice that afternoon. Spreadsheet first, then the timeline, then the emails, and finally the photos. Lighting was everything. I dimmed the lamps until the apartment felt like a tiny theater and clicked the clicker. The hum of the projector filled the room with a kind of anticipatory white noise. Before anyone says anything, I started, because the opening line matters in small domestic trials. I want everyone to see the same thing I saw when I finally sat down and counted. My voice was flat on purpose. Facts are quieter but harder to argue with. Slide 1, the spreadsheet, grid after grid of dates, amounts, and memos. The headline number sat at the top in bold, $34,126.92. Each line scrolled up, $10-12-21, rent $1,250. 020322, car repair, $420. 6/14/23 emergency, $2,100. I watched their faces as the rows marched by. Diane's mouth thinned into a line. Hannah's eyes got wide and glassy. My father, Daniel, shifted in his chair like he'd been given a puzzle with a missing piece that had suddenly fallen onto the table. I clicked. Slide 2, termination emails. Subject lines in black on white. Employment termination. Effective 08/01/24, final payroll notice. The timestamps crisp and merciless. I'd redacted anything private. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about cause and effect. The termination emails were dated the same month as a string of urgent transfers. They were a match in a forensic sense. Paper trail, policy, consequence. The room got colder. Hannah whispered, "Oh, why would she keep asking for money if she'd been fired?" My mother asked, more to the room than to me. I didn't answer. I let the next slide do the talking. Slide 3. Photos from a beach vacation. Electra in sunglasses, Electra holding a giant novelty margarita, Electra standing on a boardwalk with a sun hat that made her look smaller and still somehow entitled. I'd circled one photo and attached a screenshot of a bank memo next to it. Sent, emergency. Enjoy Florida. The juxtaposition was petty and precise. I'd printed the memo and photographed it, then enlarged it on the wall so there was no way to squint away from it. The first silence was the good kind, the kind that means people are taking inventory instead of reflexively defending. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel's jaw went slack. For a heartbeat, he looked like someone trying to reconcile a sonogram with an actual baby. Hannah stared at the wall until her eyes found mine, and in them I saw a question that didn't need words. Why didn't you say anything sooner? I showed the landlord confirmation emails next. Receipts for rent, the chain of payment IDs matching the transfers on my spreadsheet. Then I projected the Venmo history with the tiny memos. Car repair, rent, hotel deposit, each one a small, insistent pebble in the river of numbers. The visual layout was blunter than any argument. Evidence, displayed, was louder than protest. At that point, Electra walked in. She came like a storm you've already heard about on the weather app. Sudden, dramatic, and awkwardly timed. She pushed the door open with a hat still in her hand, a little wild-eyed. For a second, she looked around like someone who'd wandered into the wrong set. "Bridget, what is this?" she asked, voice pitched between outrage and panic. "Documentation," I said. "Everything is here." She took a step forward, then stopped. The projector's light painted her face in the same sterile white that had revealed the receipts. For the first time, she couldn't turn her eyes away. Electra's mouth opened. She tried to speak, and all I could hear was the electric whisper of the projector fan over the silence. My mother inhaled sharply. "Electra, is this true?" Diane asked, and for the first time, her voice was smaller. The defense softened into confusion. Electra's shoulders slumped. She was good at improvising excuses and texts, at giving performances designed to bait compassion, but an auditorium of receipts is not easily moved by improvisation. Electra started to talk. A tumble of words about misunderstandings, about "You don't know what was happening," about "I needed help." But each claim was held up to the light of timestamps and bank confirmations. When she mentioned emergency, I flicked to the date and showed the confirmation for the plane ticket. When she said she'd been trying, I brought up the email where she declined a steady job interview in favor of waiting for something better. The room's patience had a limit. Facts were crossing the line from inconvenient to incontrovertible. My father tried a different approach, the reflexive deflection. "Maybe it all looks worse than it is," he offered, a hand hovering between me and Electra, a man trying to mediate with one foot on either shore. But the spreadsheet kept marching on the wall like a slow, patient tide. The moment for rhetoric had passed. Diane's eyes filled. Not with fury then, but with a dawning realization that she'd been missing a scene in the play of their lives. We thought she was struggling," she said. There was a tremor in her voice I hadn't heard outside of funerals or hospital rooms. We didn't think. Her sentence collapsed under the weight of the images. Hannah, who'd been the family's quiet one, said something small and fierce. "Why didn't you tell us?" She directed the question at both Electra and our parents. The room folded inward. Among us, the easy answers were exhausted. Electra's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked like a child caught with cookie crumbs, and not the defiant, performative kind of caught, but the stunned, embarrassed kind. None of the family had known the full ledger. None of them had seen the spreadsheet that matched paychecks to plane tickets and promises to handshakes that never materialized. The projector's light kept the truth exact and unavoidable. They were quiet, not because they didn't have words, but because there weren't any words that could rearrange the numbers. The evidence did what evidence does. It made it harder to stay comfortable in narrative denials. My father's shoulders curled in, the posture someone takes when their sense of the world is quietly, irrevocably recatalogued. I let the room breathe in that silence. It felt like a small victory, not jagged or triumphant, but resolute. The projector hummed on, and in that steady white light, the ledger gleamed like a small, undeniable thing. They were seeing me the way I'd tried to show myself for years, not as the woman who simply enjoyed saying no, but as someone who had been quietly carrying the cost of someone else's choices. When the last slide faded, the only sound in the apartment was Electra's breath and the low, soft click of the projector winding down. The truth was out. The echoes were just beginning to form. I told them, flat and steady, that I had one more thing to say before anyone left my apartment. I felt oddly ceremonial, like I was stepping up to a lectern in a tiny, homemade courtroom where the case file had already been submitted. "I need you to know something else," I said, and I watched how the sentence landed on their faces. I'd been sitting on this for weeks, partly because I wanted the confession to be its own punctuation, partly because I liked the sensation of revelation arranged on my terms. "I accepted a promotion," I said. It sounded boring in the way triumph often does when you try not to gloat. "Senior project manager. It starts in 2 months, and I'm relocating to Boston for it." The words dissolved in the room like steam. Hannah smiled first, a small, incredulous thing, and Daniel's eyebrows climbed like floodlights. The surprise didn't come from the title, it came from the move. "Boston?" Diane echoed, as if the city had been a personality she had to get to know. "When did this happen?" "When the universe stopped letting me fund everyone else's story," I said, and there was a laugh in it that surprised me. "I interviewed. I did the work. I'm leaving to write the next chapter that doesn't have other people's debts in the margins." You could see the math click in their heads. New job, new city, fewer plates in my life to catch other people's falling things. Electra, who had been slumped in the corner like a deflated party balloon, rose, and for a moment I thought she might storm out. Instead, she walked toward me with the kind of careful, ridiculous bravery I recognized from years of watching her teeter on the edge of grown-up things without jumping. She stopped a foot away, and she did the thing people do when they finally decide to be honest. She started small. "Bridget," she said, voice folded. She broke off and then started again. "I can't make this about me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The apology was not one of those performative kitchen sink statements. It fractured. I thought I could find work when I wanted to. I thought asking you for rent would always be okay because you were kind. I didn't see how I was trapping you. I was selfish. I don't know how to be anything else sometimes. For the first time since I'd gathered the spreadsheet and the photos and the receipts, her words didn't try to blame circumstance. They didn't try to pawn the fault off on bad luck or timing or unfair systems. She looked at me like someone actually trying to find the bridge to the other person, not the exit. Her shoulders shook. She had not practiced this one in front of the mirror. My father, Daniel, who'd been quieter than I expected throughout the slideshow, folded and unfolded his hands a few times like a man testing his wrists before lifting something heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and careful, and it was the single line that surprised me the most that night. "Bridget," he said, his eyes square on mine, "I'm sorry. I minimized what you've done. I told me that you were being dramatic. I thought you were making a mountain out of a molehill. I was wrong." It was an apology that landed with more than politeness. It had weight. It pulled at something I hadn't let myself hope for. Acknowledgement from the person who'd been most willing to interpret my boundary as dramatics. He kept talking, fumbling around for the right words like a man who'd been given a new tool but not yet learned how to hold it. "I see now the work you were doing. I see that you were saving something for yourself and we just never looked. I'm sorry I didn't look harder." I watched his face, and in that tiny, humanizing moment, I registered the shift. This wasn't a theatrical, sweeping, once-and-for-all absolution. It was the beginning of something. He wasn't promising to fix everything. He was promising to try to understand. That's the kind of apology that has the quiet potential to change a pattern over time. Electra's confession kept coming, and it was messy and real. Admissions about turning down a steady job because she was waiting for better, about panicking when savings ran out, about the shame she carried that made her ask for money instead of help that would force her to be uncomfortable. Hannah, who had been scraping ice cream off her chin and watching like a juror, said quietly, "Then you need help to be self-sufficient, not a bankroll." It wasn't cruel. It was practical. Electra nodded as if that was the first thing someone had said to her that didn't include the word failure as a verdict. I didn't offer grand forgiveness. I offered honesty. "I accept the apology," I said slowly. "But forgiveness isn't an erase button. It's a new operating system. You'll need to show up differently, Electra. Not for me, not for my ledger. Why would you? But because you owe that to yourself." I felt like a teacher assigning homework, which is funny because I'd never thought of myself that way. It felt honest. When my father stood to leave later that night, he came over and hugged me in a way that took me by surprise. Not the perfunctory arm-around-shoulder squeeze, but the kind where someone holds you like they mean to remember your shape. "I'll call more," he said. "I'll actually ask. I'm sorry I dismissed you for so long." The words were small, practical promises, less theatrical than they were likely to be durable. They left with the heavy, ambiguous quiet that follows a shaky truce. Electra's apology hung in the air, genuine, fragile, and not yet backed up by sustained change. My parents' faces were marked by the kind of new knowledge that means they'd have to rewire how they talked about me at family dinners. After the door closed, I sat on the couch with a box of leftover cake that was dry but somehow necessary. The apartment felt suddenly lighter and stranger, like a room where rearranging the furniture has revealed outlets you forgot you had. Boston gleamed in my head like a distant map, and so did the work ahead, establishing boundaries in new geography, building a life that operated on my terms, not as the family's overflow valve. I felt cautiously buoyant. The apology from my father and the breakdown from Electra didn't make the past disappear, but they made the present negotiable. That night, I packed a small box of things for my move: books, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim, the folder with the spreadsheet, and I set it on the windowsill. The city's lights blinked back at me, like a constellation I'd actually earned the right to navigate. It felt like the first day of a course where the syllabus was mine to write. 1 year later, I turned 30 in a small Boston apartment that smelled faintly of espresso and freedom. There was no Facebook post, no surprise party, no one unboxing anything I dreamed of for myself. Just me, a handful of new friends from work, and a laptop that I finally bought with my own money. Its surface smudged from use, not envy. I spent the morning editing photos from a hike, the kind of slow, deliberate hobby that had once seemed too indulgent for someone always bailing others out. I'd built a life that didn't orbit guilt. Rent was paid by me, for me. My savings account was finally a noun that described abundance instead of depletion. Work was good. No longer an identity, just a place I showed up for with energy that wasn't constantly siphoned by emergencies that weren't mine. Boston had this brisk, briny air that made it hard to hold on to regret for too long. Family was still complicated, but complicated didn't mean broken. My father called every Sunday morning, like he'd set a reminder titled "Try." He didn't always know what to say, but he said something, which was new. Diane still believed in tidy narratives, but she'd stopped using the word selfish as shorthand for independent. She had even, miracle of miracles, sent me a birthday card with a note that said, "Proud of you for taking care of yourself." I'm still learning how. It was underlined twice, awkwardly, in the way people underline when they mean it. And Electra. She had found a job at a nonprofit in Baltimore. Nothing glamorous but solid, enough to pay rent without metaphoric assistance. Every few months she sent brief, cautious texts. Then, one night, as I was packing for a weekend trip, my phone buzzed with a message from her that was longer than usual. Open quote, "Bridget, I've been thinking a lot about last year. I was awful to you, and you didn't deserve that. I'm learning to stand on my own. I know it doesn't undo what I took, but thank you for forcing me to grow up. I get it now." Close quote. It wasn't grand or sentimental, it was honest. I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard, before replying simply, "I'm glad you're finding your way." That was all it needed. No lecture, no closing speech, just acknowledgement. Later that evening, I walked along the Charles River, the city lights rippling like circuits across the water. I thought about that night a year ago, the projector humming, the ledger on the wall, my family's stunned silence, and how, in a strange way, it had been a mercy. The confrontation had been the surgery. This, now, was the recovery. People think revenge is about making others hurt, but the best revenge I've learned is no longer needing to. My peace wasn't cinematic. It was ordinary, durable, quietly radical. It was the hum of a well-running life. Rent on time, coffee brewed just right, boundaries intact, and a birthday spent exactly how I wanted. On my own terms, with no debts left to collect.